Okay, good morning, my friends. This is Mrs. Crystal from over at Greenbrook, and my students like to call me silly every time I say something or do something. And I always tell them that's why they like me so much. But I have a story that I like to read to my Montessori friends that's called Don't Be Silly, Mrs. Millie. It's written by Judy Cox. It's illustrated by Joe Matthew. And this is the cover. So let's find out what the children think about Mrs. Millie. Who's so silly? Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Every day she says, "Good morning, children. Please hang up your coats." Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our coats. At 8 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Please rise for the frog salute." "Oh no," we shout. "You mean the flag salute." It's 9 o'clock. Time to write, Mrs. Millie says. "Get out your paper and penguins." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our paper and pencils." Yeah, I don't think they could write their work with a penguin, can they? At 10 o'clock, it's recess time. Our teacher looks out the window. It's just raining cats and dogs. "Don't step in a poodle." "Don't you mean puddle?" she asks, giggling. Look at the children running out. Oh my goodness, that's so silly. We play outside until our teacher blows her whistle. "Recess is over," she yells. "It's time for the chameleon." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean it's time to come in." At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Millie says, "You may get drinks, but don't cut on the lion." "You mean the line," we yell. At 12 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Time for lunch. Wash your hands with soap and walrus." "You're silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean soap and water." As we get in line, Mrs. Millie reminds us, "Don't forget your lunch bunny." "Oh, that's right, our lunch money," we shout. Mrs. Millie puts on her glasses to read the menu. "They have gorilla cheese sandwiches today." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean grilled cheese sandwiches." Oh my goodness, look at that gorilla. They can't eat a gorilla and cheese sandwich. At 1 o'clock, our teacher picks up a book. "It's story time. Come and sit on the bug." "You're silly. You're so silly," we cried. "You mean sit on the rug." Yeah, that would be kind of funny to sit on a bug, wouldn't it? At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Millie calls us to the back of the room. "It's time for art. Who wants to paint on the weasel?" "You mean the easel, Mrs. Willie?" "How can you be so silly?" we ask. Although it might be kind of fun to paint on a weasel, huh? After art, our teacher asked, "Who's hungry?" "We have parrot sticks and quackers." "We know what you mean. Carrot sticks and crackers," we yell. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Willie smiles. "What a fun day we've had, but it's time to go home. Put on your bats and kittens." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our hats and mittens." When we're ready to leave, our teacher goes to the door. "Butterfly, children." "No, Mrs. Willie," we shout. "You don't mean butterfly. You mean goodbye." Mrs. Willie laughs. We laugh too. "Butterfly, Mrs. Millie. See you gator." And we wave goodbye as we get on the octopus. And that's the end of our story. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. Well, that's all I have for you today. I'll see you soon. Butterfly. See ya, gator.